Afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this DIIS seminar on technocolonialism. My name is Naja Kleist, and I'm very happy to be here and to have you here and our speakers here. I've been looking so much forward to this seminar. It's been a long time in the making. We started planning early, and the seminar also marks the revival of a series on infrastructure as analytical approach, which is a seminar/webinar series that my colleague Jethro Norman and I started organizing in 2020 during the lockdown of you-know-what. And then now we want to revive it. And the idea with the series is to invite state-of-the-art talks by world-leading scholars, hence Mirca sitting here, on different aspects of infrastructure, very broadly understood. And it's such a pleasure to actually be in the same room as our speakers as we are today. We just talked about it before, how it changes the atmosphere to actually be in the same room. But we're also live streaming today, so I would also like to welcome those who might be watching the live stream or the video afterwards, because after all, we cannot all be in the same room. So a very warm welcome to everybody. And today we are going to discuss technocolonialism and technology as an infrastructure and humanitarianism. But before I go on to introducing our speakers a bit more, I would like to ask you a couple of questions. So, have you ever had your biometric identification taken and registered? Anybody who hasn't had that experience? No? So, for what purpose did that happen? When did it happen? Where did it happen? You don't have to share. I'm just looking at you while you think about it for 5-10 seconds or so. Yeah, so for me it happened going through immigration outside EU and for having my passport renewed recently. And it all went pretty smooth. Had I lived in another country, it might have been for voting. As you know, in a week we'll show our voting letter and mention our CPR number, and then we can vote. But in many other countries you have to have your biometric identity card and biometrics taken. If you were an asylum seeker, having your biometric, your fingerprints taken might mean whether you can ask for asylum in the country where you plan to ask or where you were asking for it, whether you would be sent to another country or deported. And if you were a refugee, you might need your biometric identification and your biometric fingerprint taken to get food rations or other supplies. And these kind of technologies often are presented as for the greater good, to facilitate identification and to avoid fraud. But they also come with a lot of risks and implications, and that is exactly what we'll be talking about today. And to do so, we have truly amazing speakers. Mirca Madianou, sitting over here, is professor in media, communication and cultural studies at Goldsmith University of London. Her current research focuses on the social consequences of communication technologies, data and automation in the global south, especially in relation to migration and humanitarian emergencies. She's the author of 2 books, including Mediating the Nation, News, Audiences and the Politics of Identity, and Migration and New Media, Transnational Families and Polymedia, and the latter is co-written with Daniel Miller. She has also written a range of journal articles, book chapters, does podcasts, etc. And earlier today, during a brown bag lunch here at DIIS, we also learned that she is finalizing a book on technocolonialism. And I can share with you that this sounds so interesting that there's already like a book. A lot of people have shown their interest and want to pre-order this book. And Mirca will give us a talk called Technocolonialism, Digital Humanitarianism as Extraction and Experimentality. And then we are so lucky that Katja Lindskov, sitting over here, gives us a comment afterwards, asking what comes after extraction. And Katja is a senior researcher at the Center for Military Studies at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. And her research focuses on security and interventions, amongst other things, that she examines in a range of contexts, including biometrics, humanitarian interventions, maritime security, and she's currently the PI of a research project on maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea with a DIIS colleague. And Katja also has a very long and interesting list of publications on these topics, including several on biometric registration in relation to voting and refugee camps. And Katja is also an old friend of DIIS, and it's very nice to have you back here for an afternoon. So after Katja's comments, we'll open the floor for questions and comments for about half an hour, and then we end around 4 p.m. or thereabout. So welcome once again to everybody, and Mirca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Naya. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the very warm introduction. And thank you, Katja, for agreeing to come as a discussant. I really look forward to the conversation. I admire your work, and so it's a great opportunity to finally meet in person. So my talk today is a sort of overview of the book I'm currently completing on technocolonialism, and this is the title of the book. When Technology for Good Can Be Harmful is the subtitle. So I'm going to start with 3 examples just to give you an idea of the issues at stake here. So in March 2016, the Silicon Valley startup X2AI launched Karim, a psychotherapy chatbot to support Syrian refugees in Lebanon. The chatbot uses natural language processing, a form of artificial intelligence, to simulate human conversations in Arabic through existing communication channels such as SMS text or Facebook Messenger. And I have an example here. This isn't actually Karim. It's its sister app, Tess, which was developed in California. So the reason chatbots have been rolled out in refugee settings is because of the prevalence of mental health issues in situations of displacement and war, and given the parallel lack of trained psychotherapists in such settings. So chatbots have been proposed as a solution, as a potential solution to meet the demand for help. And this particular chatbot was reportedly piloted on 60 Syrian men and women, or mostly men and women, a tiny sample, I'm sure you agree, for scaling up to such a large population. There are over 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And just a side note here that during the pandemic, there has been an acceleration of similar applications or chatbots because the need to deliver aid remotely was accentuated because of social distancing and so on. So Karim was developed by as I said, a Silicon Valley startup with funding from other private partners. And as I said, it's the pared-down sibling of Tess, which was developed for Californian users, where the app would be accompanied by an actual psychotherapy. So when a red flag would be raised, an actual human being would intervene. But that wasn't available in the case of Karim. It was just a pilot, just the app on its own. My second example, I should say here that that app also received a lot of attention in various global media outlets, and it was great advertisement, surely, for Tess, the main app that was used among U.S. People, citizens. My second example takes us to the Zaatari camp in Jordan, one of the largest refugee camps in the world. Since 2018, the World Food Programme has been piloting the Building Blocks program in refugee camps in Jordan. And now this is actually also rolled out in Bangladesh amongst the Rohingya refugees. So Building Blocks is essentially a cash transfer system using blockchain, a distributed ledger system integrated with UNHCR's biometric database. So building blocks allows for refugees to shop at officially sanctioned grocery stores by scanning their iris at checkout. So once the refugees' identity is authenticated on the UNHCR database, the World Food Programme releases payment to the merchant and deducts the amount from the beneficiary account. The World Food Programme blockchain keeps a record of all transactions. And as I said, this has now been piloted or rolled out in Bangladesh. And my third example is, again, something you may have come across already. It concerns the partnership between Palantir and the World Food Programme, signed in February 2019 for $45 million US. The choice of Palantir as a partner for the World Food Programme raised a lot of eyebrows, given Palantir's reputation as a CIA-backed and incredibly secretive software firm known for its work in intelligence, predictive policing, advanced biometrics, immigration enforcement, especially on the USA-Mexico border. And this particular partnership is just the tip of the iceberg, because these partnerships have become extremely common in the sector. There are thousands and thousands of public-private partnerships, and I will return to this later on in my talk. So these seemingly unconnected episodes point to significant structural transformations taking place in the humanitarian field. We're witnessing a rapid datafication and digitalization of humanitarian action. Most UN agencies now have innovation labs and data departments. The first thing that happens when a refugee comes into contact with UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, is to give their biometric data. Artificial intelligence is used to predict future crises, track displaced people, and so on. These are just a few examples. So datafication and digitization, and by datafication I mean the quantification of processes that were previously experienced qualitatively, are combined with the increasing marketization, professionalization, pressure for humanitarian accountability, and crucially the dynamic entry of the private sector in the humanitarian field. And this takes place through the public-private partnerships like this one, but of course also through the global philanthropy and foundation work, and of course the involvement of private companies as contractors, because increasingly a lot of aid projects are outsourced. So a lot of these developments are often summarized under the term digital humanitarianism, and I have here a sort of a description, a rather descriptive definition of what we might understand as digital humanitarianism. Practices that include design and software development, the collection and uses of large data sets, and the associated practices of a number of stakeholders, from humanitarian officers, donor, government officials, private companies, volunteers, software developers, and affected people themselves. So what are the consequences of these developments? Despite the claims that we're seeing a new, sort of more optimistic age of humanitarianism in a networked age, there is little evidence to support some of these claims. So in my talk here, I will try to understand these practices as part of the power relationships amongst these stakeholders. And I will draw on my fieldwork with 7 groups of stakeholders over the last few years. So I've been doing interviews with humanitarian officers, donors, private companies, and so on. So I'm also drawing on earlier fieldwork with in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan, and a year's fieldwork in the Philippines, working with communities affected by disaster and their uses of digital technology in that process. So both these projects come together in the book. So I make sense of these developments, these digital developments and other structural changes in humanitarian practices through this notion of technocolonialism, which aims to analyze the convergence of digital developments with humanitarian structures and market forces and the extent to which they reinvigorate and rework colonial relationships of dependency. So this notion recognizes that phenomena from global capitalism to displacement, to migration, to humanitarianism, to technology itself are actually steeped in colonial relations of inequality. And technocolonialism shifts the attention to the constitutive role that data and digital innovation practices play in entrenching inequalities between refugees or other vulnerable communities and humanitarian agencies, and ultimately inequalities in a global context. So how does this reworking of colonial relations take place? Through the extraction of value from the data of refugee and other marginalized communities, by extracting value from the experimentation with new technologies in fragile situations for the benefit of stakeholders, including private companies. So the Karim chatbot with which I started the talk is essentially one such example of experimentation. By materializing the intangible forms of colonial legacies, such as racial discrimination, and contributing to the production of social orders that entrench what Quijano called the coloniality of power. By dehumanizing suffering, and this happens through the bureaucratization of suffering that happens when you encounter a chatbot, for example, rather than a human being as a refugee, or when you're asked to provide your biometric data in order to determine whether you're eligible for aid or not. So this dehumanization and obliteration of accountability, because by having all these private partners involved in this process, or these multiple partners, these complex supply chains, accountability becomes very diffused. And I think that is another important element of the story here. And of course, justifying all these practices under the pretext of emergencies. So this is how technocolonialism essentially reworks existing colonial relations of inequality. And this is in some ways my conclusion, or my the essence of the argument. So I will now try to kind of backtrack a bit and show you how I arrived to this conclusion. And I should probably start by answering the question, why colonialism, and why should we still be using colonialism today? Some people might be wondering, don't we live in a post-colonial world following the independence of former colonies? But I actually argue, following work in colonial and decolonial theory, that colonial inequalities endure and metamorphose in the contemporary context. Quijano developed the notion of coloniality of power. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. To explain how the subjugation of the colonized endures after or outlives direct colonial rule and exploitation. And this happens through the dominance of Eurocentric knowledge systems and the codification of racial and social discrimination, as well as the pervasiveness of global capitalism. So those three sort of forces combine to perpetuate social domination and explain the endurance of coloniality well after independence. So several features of our societies, from the acceleration of global capitalism to migration and displacement, can be traced to colonial histories of which they have been part. Global capitalism depends on the extraction of resources, from minerals to labor, often following this north-south trajectory. And extractivism, which today, of course, extends to the extraction of data, right, is at the heart, really, of colonialism. And I guess the link between colonialism and extractivism and capitalism explains why I choose the word colonialism or the term colonialism and not imperialism, for example. I think it's very much about this relationship, although there are other elements as well. So humanitarianism is directly linked to these colonial legacies. You know, humanitarianism and international development are deeply entangled with colonial histories. Humanitarianism emerged in the colonial expansion of the 19th and 20th centuries. And although contemporary humanitarianism is understood as the supposed natural humaneness, as the expression of a supposed natural humaneness and the imperative to reduce suffering, the structural asymmetry between donors, humanitarian officers, and aid recipients reproduces the unequal social orders that shaped empire. And this is very evident, you know, when we're looking at practices like biometrics, and this actually also brings here the role of technology, which I want to talk about now, because colonial legacies can also be found in the development of technology. And this is very clear when we look at science, which was integral to the civilizing mission of colonialism. It was a tool used to justify colonial rule, and this is evident from the work of Fanon and so many other scholars. So artificial intelligence is part of these larger genealogies of enumeration, measurement, and classification that were originally developed by imperial powers to control colonial subjects. And biometrics, which in its contemporary iteration is based on artificial intelligence, was first developed in India as part of efforts, British Empire's efforts to control colonial subjects. So, and of course the colonial genealogies of science are also evident in practices of experimentation, which is again, we can observe that today in contemporary technological pilots. Of course, there are broader elements here, and this is an image of one of the first biometric, handprints, I guess, from the period of colonization in India. But we can see these practices in the contemporary context also. You know, when we're looking at our smartphones, how are our smartphones made of, with what materials, the extraction of materials under conditions of forced labor are, one way in which we can see these colonial legacies in the way technology is produced. And of course, the way technology is dumped, the fact that it ends in Africa is not accidental, or it ends in West Africa. So to understand these practices, we need an account of colonial durability. We need to really acknowledge the fact that we need to talk about colonial presence today. So technocolonialism acknowledges then that phenomena like humanitarianism, but technology itself are steeped in these colonial relations of inequity. And I want to be very clear here. When I use the term colonialism, I don't use it to refer to a new phase of colonialism, like some accounts around, for example, data colonialism might be. I do not use it as a historical prism through which to understand the present. I argue that colonialism and coloniality, if we want to use Quijano's term, has never gone away. Technology reworks and revitalizes these relations. And likewise, I want to make clear, and I hope this is clear already, that I don't use colonialism as a metaphor. It wouldn't be even appropriate to do so, given the violence associated with colonialism. To use colonialism as a metaphor would be to depoliticize the term and the phenomena that it describes. But I think we need colonialism as a framework in order to understand why technological experiments take place in the global south and not in the global north. Of course, they do also take place in the global north, but I mean, it is disproportionate, right? The extent to which they take place in the south. We need colonialism as a framework to understand why there is no meaningful consent in a refugee camp, where to refuse to submit your biometric data amounts to refusing to receive aid and shelter when you have no other alternatives for survival. And at the same time, technocolonialism is not an argument about neocolonialism. Of course, there is a connection, because technocolonialism shifts the attention to the constitutive role that data play. Data play an active role in reworking these inequities, and sometimes giving them new momentum, and perhaps a newfound durability, and sometimes even creating new inequities. So I want to now discuss the 5 logics that perhaps explain how technocolonialism works, or actually the 5 logics that help explain the push for the digital in humanitarian practices. So digital practices can be explained if we understand the intersection of these logics, right? And I'll try to take you through these one by one, starting with the logic of humanitarian accountability, and the logic of audit. These two are connected. The logic of capitalism, which is linked, of course, to the presence of the private sector. The logic of technological solutionism, securitization, which is very much the logic of the state, or primarily, but of course the acknowledgement that all of this is met with resistance and contestation. And those of you who were at the lunchtime seminar, that was the focus of the talk, of how can we think about resistance in these situations of very asymmetrical relations. And I'll try to find some time to say a few words about this now, even though there won't be a huge amount of time. So let's start with accountability. So the enthusiasm for digital innovation within humanitarianism can be partly understood as a response to the growing demand for humanitarian reform and accountability. This has been an ongoing push in the humanitarian sector for several decades. So with more than 272 million people across the world needing humanitarian assistance, and that's the prediction for 2022, but it might actually be higher than that, and over 85 million displaced people worldwide, the sector faces tremendous challenges. And humanitarianism has been criticized for reproducing the asymmetrical relations on which it is based. We've discussed this already, for disrupting local solidarities and creating new dependencies. And this has led some commentators to argue that it's even a form of neocolonialism. And digital platforms have been championed as answers to these problems. The interactive nature of platforms is assumed to give voice to displaced people and enable their participation in their own recovery. And even biometrics, when we look at digital identity programs today, the logic behind a lot of the championing of these policies is refugee protection and empowerment. Refugees will have ownership of their own identities, and they will actually have some kind of legal papers digitally. So this is really one argument, right? And this is very much evidenced in optimistic discourses about this new era of humanitarianism and the role that data can play. Now, of course, at the other side of the coin is that we have the logic of audit. So if the logic of accountability is driven by a criticism of humanitarianism and humanitarian practices, audit is really the result of its phenomenal success. The field has grown hugely over the last 2 decades, with global aid relief economy reaching $156 billion. So national governments have outsourced aid increasingly, but have remained involved as donors, and in return demand evidence of impact and metrics. And digital technologies provide easy metrics to show where aid has, who has been impacted by aid. And the increasing marketization of the field, where agencies compete for funding, is part of the story. And all this, of course, is exacerbated by the short cycle of funding. So agencies find themselves, and officers find themselves writing proposals for new funding every few months, sometimes even every few weeks, which means that they constantly need to have access to data to support their new applications. And digital technologies can provide these robust audit trails, but also data that can be used to legitimate humanitarian projects. So populations in need, through their data, legitimate humanitarian projects and justify agencies' funding applications to national governments and other donors. Now, let's move on to the logic of capitalism. I mentioned already the World Food Programme partnership with Palantir, but this is one of the many such private-public partnerships. Most major tech companies have some kind of partnership with United Nations agencies or other humanitarian organizations, Accenture, Amazon, Facebook, Google, IBM, Microsoft, just to name a few. And for private companies, the involvement in humanitarian projects represents excellent branding opportunities, as you can imagine. Increased visibility, access to new markets, access to data, opportunities to pilot projects. And a well-known critique of corporate social responsibility is that it cloaks the market in a moral discourse. It offers companies a veil for profit-making. In my experience, in interviews or, going to industry events as part of sort of a more ethnographic exploration of the humanitarian sector, I didn't see much veiled attempts. It was quite explicit that there is a sense of, let's try to, find these hidden opportunities in refugee camps. There was, industry representatives were quite outspoken, and you can see here a tweet from the Financial Times. So it wasn't really very hidden, this motivation. But I think, nonetheless, I don't, providing a veil for profit making isn't the most interesting dimension of this process. What matters is that private companies extend their authority over the social order. Private-public partnerships create opportunities for companies to pursue their political and social objectives. And by turning themselves into agencies of humanitarianism, corporations can reframe problems in line with their own agendas, right? And that can depoliticize crisis, because if you present the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean as an issue of mobile connectivity, then the emphasis is not on the political aspects of displacement, but actually on technological solutionism. So this brings me to my next logic, the logic of technological solutionism, which is very much linked with the logic of capitalism. And this is really about the idea that there can be technological fixes to very complex problems, right? This logic puts solutions before actual problems. And you can see this in a quote by one of my participants about, going into hackathons and people saying essentially that, we have blockchain, how can we find a solution? How can we find a problem for a solution? So it's not really finding a solution and then thinking, how can we address the situation, but having a solution and then finding a problem to match it. You can imagine that this is extremely problematic, partly because it also doesn't understand the contexts, then the very complex and often fragile context in which these technological interventions might be implemented. And this is evident, of course, in all these kind of discourse around failing fast and moving fast and breaking things, all these sort of Silicon Valley mantras, which seem to be incompatible, or they are completely incompatible with the humanitarian imperative of do no harm. So coupled with the logic of capitalism, the logic of solutionism extends to the normalization of technological pilots. And and that is particularly troubling. So finally, the logic of securitization, and this is really relevant in response to migrant and refugee flows. Migration in the post 9/11 context has been interpreted as a security problem, and biometric technologies, I think, are one method in which governments aim to control borders and detect the so-called undesirables and ensure security by making populations legible. The logic of securitization reduces refugees to a security threat, and the concern here is very much about function creep, which refers to the way that data might be collected for one purpose, for example, biometric registrations of refugees to address fraud in aid delivery, but they might end up being used for completely different purposes. For example, for combating terrorism, so somebody's data could end up being in a list for counter-terrorism list. So this is the logic that very much is driven by states, but not exclusively, because of course we know that the biometric sector is very much a hugely profitable sector and a hugely expanding sector. I said earlier that all this has to be understood also in relation to resistance. Where are refugees and other humanitarian subjects in this process? So we need to recognize that contestation exists even in the most asymmetrical settings. And I think it's also important to understand that there are moments of overt contestation, but very often contestation also necessitates that we look below the radar in the kind of small everyday practices. As DIIS says, we need to descend into the everyday to really be able to observe the small everyday practices which could show contestation. This doesn't mean that there is a reversal of power relations here. Not there isn't, but we need to really take into account what happens on the ground and how people actually respond to these various practices, whether these are more overt, sort of politicized forms of protest, or whether there might be small acts of contestation and even appropriation of technologies in oppositional ways. Don't have much time to talk about this, and we had a chance this morning to discuss it at length, but it could be something to return to in the discussion. But I just wanted to put it out there that I'm fully aware this is hugely important as well. So let me now show you how these different logics intersect to produce forms of discrimination and extraction and also this dehumanization that I was talking about in the beginning of my talk. And I want to focus on one example because I don't think we have much time, and that will be the Rohingya response, which has been taking place since 2017, actually, in Bangladesh. So, as you probably know, between 2017 and 18, over 1 million Rohingya refugees arrived in Bangladesh after fleeing genocide in Myanmar. In 2018, UNHCR, together with the Bangladesh government and the contribution of a private contractor, organized a digital identity program aiming to collect all refugee biometric data. So we can really discern here the logics of securitization, audit, accountability, and capitalism, behind the adoption of biometric registrations. And this has to be seen also as part of the effort of the sector to create a massive database that would collect, that would contain all biometric data of all refugees. I don't actually think this was ever delivered, Primes. I think it hasn't really materialized for all I know. But there was this aim that UNHCR would have this database, massive database called Primes, available by the end of 2019. So in relation to the Bangladesh registration, there were a number of particular issues adding to the more general concerns about biometrics. While biometrics is assumed to be an objective identification method, there is ample evidence that it codifies discrimination. Biometric technologies privilege whiteness, with a significant higher margin of error when measuring or identifying other bodies. And we know from the research of many scholars that biometrics systematically discriminates in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, class, disability, and age. And I have here statistics from Joy Bolamwini's and Timnit Gebru's study. You've probably seen this because it's been shared so much, but their study on gender shades, which looks at the face recognition varies tremendously depending on one's gender and race. And this just is one example of the existing problems with biometric measuring. But yet these concerns haven't stopped humanitarian organizations with biometric registrations. In fact, there has been an acceleration in recent years, and as I said, also the use of biometrics in all sorts of practices, some of which are not really ordinary practices, like caste distributions, one of the examples I started with. So in the Rohingya registration, the bias and power asymmetry inherent in all biometric measurements was compounded by specific practices which further materialize discrimination and risks for this specific population. So, for example, this particular registration did not offer the option Rohingya to the refugees. It wasn't listed as a possible identity for them. And this is striking because this was a system, developed to register them. Instead, refugees were called Myanmar nationals, which is a term that they despised, and they often many refugees were very vocal about this. They said this could pave our way for repatriation, and we're very concerned about this. The power asymmetries involved in biometric registrations are further exacerbated by the fundamental of any meaningful consent. So there is a lack of meaningful consent here during refugee registrations. I mentioned this earlier as well, because to refuse to give your biometric data, refuse to participate in this digital identity program means that you cannot then be eligible for assistance. And you cannot, this isn't really a choice because you don't have any other choice in that context. You cannot, you're not allowed to work, you're not even allowed to buy a mobile phone without a form of identification. So, this shows you really the asymmetries within which these biometric registrations take place. And of course, the other issue that was very typical for this registration concerns function creep. Refugees were very concerned that their data might be shared with the government of Myanmar. And in fact, last year, in 2021, this was proven right. There was some data sharing, and this has been reported quite widely, and I wanted to have that slide up there, but I'm aware it's not included in this particular PowerPoint. But this was, this has been now proven to be correct. So for all these reasons, this was a particularly problematic registration. I need to really acknowledge here that refugees were not passive in this process. They actually voiced their concerns. There was a lot of activism in the camps. And in fact, actually, in November 2018, groups of Rohingya in Cox's Bazar went on strike protesting about the biometric identity cards. And they, this received some publicity. But of course, what happened is that the Bangladesh government sent in the police and the protests ended in violence, and the following day the registrations continued apace. So again, if you want an example of the violence of technocolonialism, I think this is really a very poignant one, a very powerful one. So we can see here the constitutive role that data and digital innovation practices play in entrenching inequalities between refugees and humanitarian agencies, and ultimately inequalities in the global context, while technology and data practices rework and revitalize what Stoller calls the imperial debris. My argument is not solely a technological one. Neither technology nor neoliberalism can explain the geopolitical significance of humanitarian interventions. The fact that technological experiments and these biometric registrations take place in refugee camps or among displaced people can be explained if we understand the tenacity of imperial formations and the often hidden legacies of colonial domination. And at the same time, technology and data play an equally significant role in sustaining these inequalities in the humanitarian system. And I think the mutual constitution of actual colonial legacies and technological infrastructures and capitalist forces is what distinguishes my approach from other efforts to theorize data colonialism. So digital innovation and data practices materialize the often intangible but very real colonial formations and give them new life and vigor. While power asymmetries are immediately visible in refugee registrations, I argue that they're also present in the seemingly more empowering experience of shopping, and shopping in inverted commas, through biometric data with which I started this talk. So I'm referring here to the building blocks scheme. So building blocks appears to be like a gamified version of the logic of the camp, whereby a refugee submits their data without really knowing how that data will be used and without the option to refuse in order to be eligible for aid. So building blocks exemplifies neoliberal humanitarianism as refugees are imagined as entrepreneurs with digital wallets, digital identities, ready to start a business, while the camp is rebranded as a place of opportunity. In fact, the image of the empowered refugee projected through the building block scheme occludes the stark inequalities involved here. Yet the reality is rather different. Whilst acknowledging refugee agency, the persistence of power asymmetries is impossible to ignore. Biometric technologies are part of the digital systems of migration management, which control refugee mobility by constituting new types of traceable digital bodies, which are open to additional forms of intervention and surveillance. We have this sense almost of digital encampment, right? That you might even leave the camp, but you never leave because your data will always follow you, and that kind of history will always follow you in perpetuity. So while refugee digital body parts travel through digital systems and databases, the actual physical bodies are most typically stuck in camps for years. Most people don't leave the camp. If refugee data are extracted for profit, this contrasts with any actual benefits for the data owners. The digital traceable body is a liminal body as it invites the intervention of the border in perpetuity. So despite acts of resistance, and there are many acts of resistance, these power asymmetries are very hard to reverse. Rather than being a solution, datafication and digital practices become part of the problem of displacement. Thank you.
Much, Mirca. That was really excellent and thought-provoking, slightly disturbing also. Some of these interventions and practices. So I now give the word to Katja and her comments.
Is it on already?
I think you need to turn it on.
Turn it on. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to discuss these matters. It's great to be back at DIIS, and it's very, very great to see you, Mirca. I think the reason I was invited is that I have worked specifically on biometrics since 2010. And for me, it's also a moment to reflect on the critique that has been voiced now for more than 10 years. So I really find it very, very interesting space to navigate, because on the one hand, you keep having stories of all the things that can go wrong, but then at the same time, biometrics keeps expanding. So UNHCR are increasing their databases daily. It's become a mandatory policy to register every refugee with their biometrics, and sort of it started in the humanitarian field, but what I've observed is that it just expands to other domains. I work on piracy as well. You register pirates so that you can see if they're the same pirates that you capture next time. As both of you also alluded to, it's become an increasing the popular way to assess whether elections are held democratically in countries, even if we would never do this in a European context, in many African states, in an increasing number of African states. If you do not volunteer your biometrics, you cannot vote. So on the one hand, it's a practice that has been critiqued for many years, but then at the same time, it's a practice that keeps expanding. So I think also with this, the testing of technologies has happened since day one in this field. My initial case study, and I think it also goes to show a little bit of, so my key question is also what drives this and what initially drove this. I think it's very difficult for me to separate it from 9/11. This initially was a counter-terror technology. This is why we put it in our passports. This is why we went through this in airports, because the enemy had changed and we didn't know who was who. And the only way that you could see that you were you and you were the one who it says on your passport is to register someone's physical measure. So it's only I who have this iris scan. It's only I who have this biometric fingerprint. And I think for me, even if it moves into the humanitarian context, this counter-terror drive behind the technology still lingers. So the first case I looked at was the UNHCR use of biometrics on the Afghan-Pakistan borderland in October, right after 9/11. So this was the first time UNHCR tested the use of biometrics on refugees that wanted to repatriate back to Afghanistan, which I think it could have been anywhere, but it wasn't. It was on that borderland. And what I just want to emphasize was that it was quite, even at that time, the language around it was very experimental. So they called it a pilot, they called it an experiment. They wanted really to find out so many things about how a technology that was developed in a Western laboratory setting would work when it was in the field, under heat and humidity. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and what then happened when it didn't work. They wanted to test what happened if you scaled up the technology. So this was the first time that it was used, perhaps besides India, on a very large scale. So I think from day one, the laboratory experimentation was taken on a little bit uncritically by the humanitarian community. Nonetheless, it expanded from being different experiments, different places, mostly on the African continent, but also in the Middle East, to UNHCR fairly recently saying that this is now a mandatory thing that we do. So it moved from being little pilot tests to being a strategy. So this is now the official policy of UNHCR. Every time we aid a refugee, we need their biometrics. And when you ask them for how long they keep it, that's indefinite. Anyone could again become a refugee, so we never delete any refugee data. So that's how I spent the first part of my research on this, discovering more and more what was also, as I think both of you said, an alarming trend to follow and something that you wanted to be careful about. but I think what worries me is how the critique is taken in. I since looked beyond the humanitarian because of the counter-terror context that to me is quite important. I started asking where this, so the point I had to your excellent presentation was beyond extraction, consequences of extraction, and conditions of extraction. So I think I spoke already about conditions of extracting. I fully agree that there is very much experimentation, and to a degree that you would never see in any other context. I recently was very surprised to find that for the World Food Programme, it seems very legitimate to fingerprint infants in Somalia, which you couldn't imagine in other contexts. So the kind of reflexivity about whether these practices would be accepted in any other place, they don't really, it's that kind of, but it's an emergency and we can do this and we also want to help. So that's on the conditions of extraction. I recently even used the term laboratory. And I think it's part of the coloniality, how it's reworked and reinforced, even by humanitarian actors who you would think had a different logic. This doesn't really seem to be the case. They reinforce often via these data practices the understanding of refugees as someone that you can experiment on in ways that you couldn't with other people. So that's on the conditions of extraction. On the consequences of extraction, most of my work has focused on the unintended consequences of extraction. And I think there are so many ways that during the past 12 years, things have gone wrong. One example is the Myanmar case that you just explained, but I think also when coalition forces left Afghanistan on the 15th of August last year, they had built up huge biometric databases of those that had kindly collaborated with coalition forces. And those databases the Taliban regime gained access to as we left very, very quickly in an unplanned way. I know it's moving out of the humanitarian context, but I don't think it's irrelevant for humanitarian actors to think about what happens after they extract the data. So there are conditions around data extraction that are challenging in themselves with experimentation, but I also think there is a huge challenge thinking what happens after extraction. What are the unintended consequences? And for me, I think there is at least 3 different types. There is the Palantir case of deliberate data sharing agreements. The UNHCR has a data sharing agreement with the US Department of State. So there are more data flows than what one would imagine, considering that it's a humanitarian context where this data is being produced. The other type of unintended consequence, I think, is that it's become, as you kind of also alluded to, Mirca, these databases are so big that they're interesting to other actors. So even humanitarian actors have experienced hacks. So this is true for UN databases, this is true for ICRC databases, and I think it's a concern that happens after extraction. So you have extracted all of this data, but how can you protect it? It's almost like these practices necessitate a new understanding of protection. You need to protect your refugees, but you certainly also need to protect the data because it's directly linked to their physical security or insecurity. And the final way that things can go wrong after extraction is the case of the Taliban. It can just end up, that's the same in Somalia that I've written on, it can just end up in the hands of actors who are not interested in the safety of those that the data was intended to protect. Certainly for the Taliban, of everyone that collaborated with the regime that tried to fight them, but also in Afghanistan where you have in Somalia where you have actors that are not very interested in collaborating with anyone who would have received food aid, other kinds of aid from Western actors. It even represents, to those that I interviewed in Somalia, it even represents a challenge for humanitarian actors just carrying the biometric device that they need to use to take these biometric fingerprints. And that's the kind of beyond extraction, because I think there is a during extraction and beyond extraction, but I think we really, really need to think very carefully about the unintended consequences. And I think the best way to move the agenda forward is also to ask what drives this. So I think as long as it's about refugee vulnerability, but I think it's also about increasingly making the argument that humanitarian actors will be heard as well. So it's not very good for UNHCR to have a story where they are the ones who delivered data to a regime that subsequently targeted these people. So there is something about how it comes back to the not security, but the identity of the actors who wants to be seen as helping. And then I think it's also increasingly a discussion to be had with donors. Why is it that the donors are pushing so hard for humanitarian agencies? It's about the logic of accountability, but there is a lack of accountability as soon as the data has been extracted. So accountability for whom and whose data. I don't think I want to take up too much time because we also need to have a Q&A before 4 o'clock. But I think it's worth thinking about whether extraction sufficiently conveys the message that we risk making subjects more vulnerable. Because extraction can be seen as you extract gold from a gold mine and then you leave. And of course the village is poorer, but they're not necessarily newly insecure. And that would be my argument with biometrics. In some cases, biometric data is taken from subjects who are newly vulnerable and they don't know to what. It could be as a consequence of a hack. It could be as a consequence of coalition forces leaving a country. It could be as a consequence of a data sharing agreement that UNHCR thought it was a good idea to have. So I think actually, I fear that even if extraction is a really strong term, I'm not sure it conveys enough how much we risk making subjects worse off, not just extracting, if I can put it that way. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Katja. I think that's a very good start for our discussion, and I will of course ask you, Mirca, to respond, and then we'll open up to the floor.
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you, Katja. This is really great. I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I think on so many of the points that you made. On extraction, I think extraction is just one part of the story. It is, and that's why I said, you know, when we're looking at the reworking of colonial relations of inequity, we need to look at this process of dehumanization that happens during extraction, but also after, because this isn't just about, you know, the moment where you give your biometric data. I think these processes that we're describing here are also about, you know, the molding of subjectivities. You know, it is about, you know, entrenching these inequalities. You know, if it is always refugees who give their biometric data and you have the white humanitarians collecting data, you know, this is, you know, a particular structure, you know, within which, you know, one's identity is formed. And I think that is really important. And I think those things can have very lasting consequences, apart from the security issues, which I agree with you are tremendous. And this is also the problem with the digital, because it is forever, because it is in perpetuity. You were absolutely right to say that it isn't just about the collection of data, but it is what do you do with the data, especially when these data, are kept forever. There is no horizon, of like 5 years or whatever. And there is, again, this sense that because we are operating outside the European context where we have some legislation, it's not perfect, but there is a little bit of legislation with GDPR, these things would not be allowed. But because we are talking about countries with no legal framework, of course, anything goes, really. And there we find the situations like you described in Afghanistan and, of course, in Myanmar, but potentially also elsewhere, because we simply don't know. And the systems are not infallible, because no system is perfect anyway, but we've had so many hacks of UN databases in recent years. So this is really important. But that's why I think colonialism is the framework, because it encompasses things like extraction. It doesn't stop there, and it talks about experimentality, which is the logic of experimentation, right? Which can have impacts on people's subjectivities. It talks about the bureaucratization. It talks about the enchantment of technology even. And so it encompasses all these processes. It doesn't just focus on extraction. And the emphasis ultimately is on, what happens to people's lives and what happens to the way people live, which is why resistance is important, but also how people experience these structures in their everyday lives matters as well.
Great, thank you, Mirca. So there are 2 questions. Let's take them first. So the gentleman in the corner, and then the other gentleman in the other corner. Well, it was actually... Yeah, we can just... we'll take them in a row. So you then... you start, and then afterwards. It's for the live stream. You need to...
Okay, sorry, with apologies to the people in the live stream. Hi, thank you very, very much. I have a short question and a longer question, if I may. So the short question is just, what would UNHCR say if you asked them why they collected the data in that way? Mm-hmm. The longer question is this. So I was thinking about the sort of very long list of things that refugees can't access without registration, biometric registration in primes these days. You can't work, you can't buy a mobile phone, you can't access healthcare. And I thought, I've just moved to Denmark, and it is of course true that in Britain it is far easier, where you do not need biometric registration to access any of those things. It's much easier for a migrant to access that stuff, right? It is much easier to go under the radar of the state in Britain than it is in Denmark. But there are reasons why Danes like doing it the way that they do it, right? And so, playing slightly devil's advocate with you, it occurs to me that these kinds of biometric identities are ways in which states govern us, but they are also ways in which we hold states to account and demand things back from them, right? Here are some good reasons why you might want biometric registration in a refugee camp. You might want to be able to establish the length of someone's stay so that they can establish a claim to legal citizenship. You might want to establish that that child is their child so that you can reunify them. You might want to prepare a case for resettlement to Australia and Canada. You might want to do a needs assessment so that when you go to the budget round fight with the person representing Kakuma or Zatari or Nakavali camp, that you can get these things that you do need. You might even, whisper it softly, want to do something participatory in the camp where you put refugees in charge of something. That requires you to have some sense of who is to be counted. When you go and vote in a Danish election, you have to prove this is who I am. Any kind of empowerment exercise in a camp will likely require the same sort of thing. These are honourable reasons to do this. They are not dishonourable. They are not bound up with terrible profit-making rationality or coloniality or even securitization logics. And whilst it might be true that some refugees prefer a sort of art of not being governed invisibility, I suspect that's a bit like the way in which many Danes, well, maybe not many Danes, but some Danes might prefer a more British system of registration to a Danish one. These are things about which people might reasonably disagree, aren't they?
Shall I?
No, let's take the other question.
That's already a lot there.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. My name is Tor Magnussen, but the question is, the one is for Maria. I didn't quite grasp why you insisted on making a division of colonialism and imperialism.
Okay.
And especially when you refer to Frantz Fanon and the Samir tradition in that way, I presume that there must be another reason not to label it also imperialism. That's the first question. The second question is maybe more for Katja, and that is this use of biometric systems with refugees. Are you aware whether the system which existed at that time, but whether it was used also for refugees from Kosovo who went to Macedonia, or now Northern Macedonia, and Albania in 98, 99, if you also take the return in account. And secondly, do you know whether the Danish NGOs, like the Danish Dansk Flygtningehjælp, the Danish Refugee Council, whether they also, like a sort of intercontinental NGO like UNHCR, use these biometrics, and especially do you know also if the Danish authorities use it when they extradite people from Denmark? That was the case before the change in Afghanistan, where people were returned to torture by the extradition of the Danish authorities. Because that could be very useful, maybe also to have them back, so that the responsible people for this extradition could be put on trial. Thank you.
Great. A lot of things to discuss already. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, okay, how do you, well, thank you all for your questions, first of all. What would UNHCR say? UNHCR is not one thing. There would be different actors, depends who you ask, and where they are in the organization, if you go to the very top or further down. But I think you would hear things like around, arguments around audit, but also security. But I think what's interesting for me is that you begin to hear also an answer that is tautological, that we collect data because that's what we do. We collect data because we need to have this database. So I think that's interesting because it shows you that the database itself and the practice of collecting data becomes an end in and of itself, which is quite interesting. And this kind of complete normalization. So that's one observation. I mean, nobody would say just that, but I've heard that, that it is, that we have to collect data because it is what we're supposed to be doing. Now, you mentioned a range of really important practices, like, we need to have data about who is in the camp, how long they've been here. We need to make cases for people to be able to for families to be reunified. You don't actually need biometric data for that. You could have, you could have a lot of data. Well, I think that's it. It is a lot easier, and it is the ease, that is the motivating force here, that you actually save a lot of time. And actually that's a lot what UNHCR say, that it saves you a lot of time. You can do things a lot faster. That's what that's the classic argument. It's about efficiencies. But actually, if the risks are significant, why would you use biometric data for practices where it isn't actually necessary? You might need to have biometric data for some things, but why would you, for example, need to have cash distributions with biometric data when the risks can be so high? And even, the head of the Innovation Accelerator, I think, had in a public talk at some point said that isn't the purpose. The purpose here isn't, we could have done this with a spreadsheet. So I think really the question is, why would you then use biometric data if a lot of these practices, which are important and you need to have that information, would require, private data that if hacked, then the risks could be huge and very detrimental to these particular populations, because you can change a password or a PIN, but you cannot change your fingerprints. Or if you can, but it is, it involves mutilation. It isn't. it just doesn't make sense. So although I agree with you that you need to have good data, you don't always need biometric data. It seems very heavy-handed for some of these practices. The contrast between Denmark or the UK or refugee camp is a good one, because of course my biometric data, I've given my biometric data for my passport and so on, but I'm not in a position of great vulnerability, and therefore I think that's where you see the asymmetries, and that's why technocolonialism, I think, is probably a useful framework. I don't think I would use technocolonialism to really try to make sense of my experience and the potential, breach of my biometric data, or the fact that my data is probably stored in some file in some sort of Arctic data center, as part of surveillance capitalism. Of course, we know this happens, but the impact on me would not be as severe if I was a refugee in a camp. And that's why I think we're looking at these inequities, which brings me to your question, which I agree. I mean, colonialism and empire are connected, right? You can't think one without the other. I guess the reason I chose colonialism is because I wanted really to rethink of imperial relations. Empire forces us a bit to think of an imperial center and a relationship of imperial sovereignty, which wasn't really what I was after. I'm not here talking about US empire or British empire. It's more of an invitation to rethink what colonial relationships and durabilities are. And so I felt that colonialism allowed me to do that, plus the emphasis on extractivism, which is an element of the story, was also another reason. So, but I agree with you that you can't understand one without the other, absolutely.
Thanks for your questions also from me. I think actually UNHCR, when they do case-by-case explanations, they have good ones. So sometimes you want to show, in the Afghan case I looked at, they had a limited number of repatriation packages, and they wanted to make sure that those few packages reached as many as possible. So you can't have the same finger beep the scanner twice, because then you're told to go behind in the queue and it goes to someone else. The same thing for accountability. Sometimes you want to show that the numbers are the numbers they are. The donors say they're inflated, but you want to provide correct numbers. And sometimes I think in contexts like Somalia, there is just a requirement from donors that they want to make sure that the assistance they provide don't go to financing terror. So on a case-by-case basis, the logics are sometimes more easy to understand. My concern is that it's become a standard practice. So you very rarely have the argument about whether this is worth doing anymore. It is because it's the standard practice. So that's what UNHCR does in any case, without the kind of, is it really needed? Why are we doing it? So that was my first point. The other one is that I think one thing is the reasons for doing it. If you decide, for me, should be on a case-by-case basis. If you decide to do it, it is as much about the reasons for doing it as it is about the practices, on the other hand, that donors are far more reluctant to fund. So very few donors would be happy to put a lot of funding into securing databases or asking UNHCR to do follow-up on retention periods. Why do you need to keep this data forever, wherever you collect it? Are there not cases where this crisis is long over? We don't really need this data anymore. So I think there are questions on the other side that are very rarely asked because no one is interested, and the ones that are badly affected by negative consequences rarely are asked for their opinions. On the biometrics in Macedonia, Kosovo, was that your question? I'm actually not sure. I don't think so. I think for UNHCR, iris recognition on the Afghan-Pakistan borderland was the first time they trialed that technology. I cannot say if it's been used by other agencies. It's probably not unlikely, but for UNHCR, 2001 was the first trial they did. And I think you're right in sort of saying it's as much about when it's collected, as it's about the purposes that it's used for afterwards. And that's indeed my biggest concern, whether it's when you seek asylum. I think the UNHCR's agreement with Department Homeland Security in the US was actually that it should just be to share data on refugees that seek resettlement, or what the could be. But in effect, it became a backdoor through which to share far, far, far more data than what was ever even being considered repatriating or resettling in the US. So I think there are many ways to look critically at how biometrics is used after extraction.
Okay, Lotte, I have a burning question, and we have time for one more question also, if anybody else has a question. So yeah, Lotte first, please.
Yes, well, thank you for a very fascinating presentations and topic. I have many issues I would like to discuss, but one thing that maybe most particularly I would like to ask you very openly, because I really don't know anything about that, but in terms of the GDPR and to what extent that would protect European citizens better than any other in the world, is there any discussion in the international human rights legal sphere to get this kind of data protection in a more global context, and to what extent does this discussion take place among humanitarian workers, if at all, especially now after the severe hacks and the problems that are clearly manifesting themselves more often? Is there no discussion at all about this? Or do you see it likely that the criticism is actually taking on and might generate some new policy making in this field? Because now it just sounds so worrying that you can't imagine there's no one that's actually really. And a second, just small thing about the efficiency. How do you counter, or how is the cost, the price tag, taken into account? Because I mean, I guess most of these technologies are just extremely expensive. So to what extent does that actually, is that taken into account? Thank you.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to ask about GDPR as well. If you know if that applies for asylum seekers in the EU, I mean, and for organizations operating out of EU, because certainly as a researcher, I mean, there are all kind of implications of where we collect data and how long they can be stored. I don't know if you know that. And then a question in relation to that, so about digital encampment, as you mentioned, Mirca, and earlier today you talked about resistance. So are you aware of people who try to leave their biometric lives, so to speak, behind?
All right, shall I start?
Yeah, you
can. Great questions again. About leaving your biometric data, I mean, other scholars have done work on this, especially with migrants trying to come into Europe. So there is research that shows how migrants try to circumvent visa programs, may even mutilate their fingers to avoid being detected, tamper with passports and visa documents. So there is quite a lot of good work on this, and this isn't. There's a whole mini industry behind this, because of course the desire to go abroad is large, and there are strong factors behind migrant flows. So there is evidence of that taking place. I haven't come across this in my research. The truth is that once you are in camps, I mean, this is the experience of most refugees, is that you tend to get stuck there for years. And I think concerns that refugees have raised is that when they go away, that there is a data trail that follows them that might include not just their biometric data, but biometric data coupled with other more personal data that have been collected. For example, it's not clear to refugees, for example, how much of their, for example, shopping habits might be included in personal records somewhere if, we're talking about the building block scheme that I was discussing earlier with you. So I think also the lack of clarity that refugees have about what happens to their data and where the data goes and who has access to it just speaks volumes about, again, the inequities here, right? You can't, roll out a system where people are not fully aware of what happens to their data. So that answers this question to some extent. GDPR, I think GDPR on the whole, I mean, it's not a perfect scheme, and it doesn't, it has very limited powers, but on the whole, it has made a good contribution to some extent, but it has very limited jurisdiction. So, when we're talking about contexts outside the European Union, then, it doesn't have any effect whatsoever. I think it may have forced some reflexivity among some organizations. So I think there is definitely some debate happening. And some organizations like Oxfam have a moratorium, for example, on the use of biometric data. So, I think there are some developments. I have personally come across some extremely thoughtful responses by humanitarians themselves in terms of, their practices, not just about biometrics, other practices as well. The problem here is that we're talking about a system, right? We're talking about almost like a bureaucratic machine. And I think that is the difficulties, that you don't see individual voices being able to change that. So I have wonderful interviews where very important critiques have been voiced, but the change is not there. And I think that is, perhaps one of the most depressing findings in some ways. And I think I want to acknowledge that humanitarianism isn't one field. I mean, there are many different actors in it, and so it depends very much who you speak with. People involved in frontline operations can be the fiercest critics of some of the practices we're talking about here. And I think you also have in this space private companies, entrepreneurs who may not share some of the principles, for example, through which some of the humanitarian workers have been formed. And sometimes they are much more sort of optimistic about what these technologies can achieve, and perhaps more reluctant to listen to some of the critiques. So there is a variety of voices. I wouldn't say that it's one. Not everyone speaks in the same voice. I don't know if I've answered everything. There were so many questions. Oh, the question on efficiency, that's really important. Well, I think that's for me great, because there's always this argument that efficiencies are one of the major factors why these technologies are used. Efficiencies and audit trails. But actually, if you look at the economics, I don't think it always makes sense, because these are expensive systems, also expensive data to keep. So I would love to see a great study that looks at the economics of all this. But it seems to me that sometimes I'm left thinking there are other logics at play here, from securitization to the logic of capitalism that I mentioned earlier, and technological solutionism as well.
Okay, so
Katja wanted to respond to.
No, I just had a few reflections, because I think it's true that it's quite important to distinguish. Oxfam and ICRC actually have developed biometric policies, and they have a little bit of a different approach than UNHCR. But my point in the talk was that I think what is really missing in the moment is donor accountability. They're just funding and pushing humanitarian actors to collect ever more data, and they're very interested in accessing this data as well. So I think what is really missing on the sort of along the lines of your GDPR question is donor responsibility in all of this. I don't see that being discussed at the moment. And then I think actually, I mean, on your point on sort of what do humanitarians think themselves, I don't actually always think that they are fully aware when a system is rolled out. So I had a discussion with the former head of biometrics at UNHCR, and they really thought it was a very good idea to anonymize the data, because then it couldn't do harm to the individual, so this was decided. But then my critique was, what happens when you have a false match? You've seen this in quite a lot of contexts. So you have a false match. The reason I can tell the US border police that I'm not a terrorist is because I have a passport that shows I'm Katja, I'm not this terrorist. The refugees do not. So they ended up unintentionally creating a system where they couldn't tell when a false match was a false match. But it wasn't intended in that way. It was seen as like we would give these refugees additional protection if we anonymize the data. So I think there is a lot of these sort of, we didn't know when we rolled it out in this way. So I really mean it when I say unintended consequences. It doesn't mean that they're not harmful, but they're not intended. And I think research has quite a role to play in sort of digging into what could happen if you roll out these systems.
Okay, there's a burning question, short one in the corner, and then we'll close because it's now 4 o'clock.
Allow me to return to the question on the refugees from Kosovo. It's my impression that the way that so quickly a voters registration could be made, and that is of course also depending on in which country we speak about, but the voter registrations were based on biometrics information, and that I guess must have been obtained during the refugee crisis in 1999. So, but it's not my field of research, these biometrics. But then my question is, could you try to make a little layout on how we could make research in this particularly question, because it's very essential. And secondly, the little question is, the Danish government at the moment have plans of making Rwanda camp, or whatever we call it, in Rwanda, but they also have an intention of making a prison in Gilan in Kosovo. Of course, both the refugees and the prisoners have different needs, and for that the use of biometrics could be very useful. That is to say, to have an interpreter, which should be the language of the doctor, and even for handicapped people, if they are in a prison, like the pirate is in the Danish pirate is intended to do, then is an elevator in this? Is it needed because of the person's handicap? And will there be an elevator in the prison?
I think that the question that I can mostly answer in this is to acknowledge that it is definitely important to focus not only on one actor collecting biometrics, because it might very well be that UNHCR started doing this quite shortly after 9/11, but that's not to, I mean, the technology was ready for them to use. So of course it has been developed earlier and tested by other agencies. So I think my recent work on Somalia was not to focus on an actor, but on a setting. And if you do that, you really, really quickly realize how many different actors collect biometrics. So this is from FAO to IOM to refugee camps it's just such a broad, to voter registrations in Somaliland with a university that is testing the system there. So there is a very, very big range of actors, which is also why I've come to look at humanitarian technology from a sort of, you can't only look at the humanitarian actors, because they operate in this space where they don't even know that the data they collect is only on their databases. So a lot of different actors collect biometrics, which is also why it's difficult to answer your question. Because it could Frontex collects biometrics. There's so many different actors, but you're definitely right that it's the multiplicity and the invisible links between them. So if we could look at these in silos, so there is UNHCR data, there is US counter-terror data, there is Frontex data, but I don't think that's the case. So I think it's very much about mapping what the actors are and trying to understand what the links are. And that could be Denmark, Rwanda, Denmark, another country. It could be country to country, but it could also be agency to agency. So that's actually how I use the notion of infrastructure, because it's not so much about the actor, and it's not so much about, I think if we come to this from a conception that it's about military intervention or about humanitarian intervention or about development assistance, we actually fail to see that it's about an infrastructure that spans all of these. So that's how I looked at it.
Great. Do you want a final comment, Mirca?
No, I completely agree with this idea of infrastructure, and I think the digital lends itself to that because of its reproducibility, you know, and I think that's where we see that data become constitutive of these colonial legacies and genealogies, because they can, by being so easily reproduced and so easily transported across different systems, and being permanent records as well, they can entrench, you know, materialize these relationships of inequity. So that's all.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you, and especially to the two of you. This has been so insightful, inspiring, disturbing, and yeah, the dilemmas are huge, I think, the risks and implications. So yeah, thank you so much, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon and evening.
Thanks so
Thank you
much
for coming.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.